Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you are at. I'm Aaron Yao. I'm the designated federal officer, the DFO for the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, CASAC. In my role as DFO, I'd like to formally open this public meeting. The CASAC is an independent expert advisory committee chartered under the authority of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. The CASAC is empowered under the Clean Air Act to provide independent advice to the EPA administrator on the scientific and technical bases for EPA's National Ambient Air Quality Standards. FACA and EPA policy require that CASAC meetings be announced to the public in the Federal Register, and that substantive deliberations and interactions with EPA and the public be conducted in open sessions where DFO is present to ensure that the requirements of FACA are met. FACA also requires that public meetings provide an opportunity for public comment. Written public comments have been received and were distributed to the CASAC Lead Panel and posted on the meeting webpage. There were no requests from the public to make oral comments. Minutes will be prepared to summarize discussions and action items in accordance with the requirements of FACA. I will work with the chair to certify the minutes and have them posted on the CASAC website. The CASAC consists of special government employees appointed by EPA to their positions. As government employees, the members are subject to all applicable ethics laws and implementing regulations. The SAB staff office has determined that advisors participating in this meeting have no financial conflicts of interest or appearance of a loss of impartiality under federal ethics regulations relating to the topic of this meeting. For those on the phone, I would like to note that we have a live video webcast of this meeting. To access it, go to casac.epa.gov, then click on today's meeting and you should see the link to the live video webcast. To those watching the live video webcast, please send me an email indicating your attendance. If you had previously requested a call-in number, you do not need to email me again. I would now like to turn the meeting over to Dr. Leanne Shepard, chair of the CASAC.
Thank you, Aaron, and welcome to everyone. Welcome to the CASAC Lead Panel. This is a consultation of EPA's Integrated Review Plan for the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for Lead, Volume 2. And the goal of the consultation is for CASAC to provide advice to EPA during this meeting and through our individual comments. CASAC will not be providing consensus comments or a letter to the EPA administrator. So to start out the meeting, I invite the members of the panels to introduce yourselves. Please turn on your video when you speak, both when you introduce yourself and also during the meeting. Starting with myself, I'm the Roman Haas Professor of Public Health Sciences, and I'm also professor in both biostatistics and environmental and occupational health sciences at the University of Washington. My expertise is in study design and exposure assessment and modeling and its impact on inference for epidemiologic studies. So going down the roster, first up is George Allen.
Good morning, everyone. I'm George Allen. I'm the chief scientist at NESCOM, that's in Boston. I'm a former chartered CASAC member during the previous lead review and a member of several other CASAC panels going back to 2004. Expertise is in measurement methods, aerosol science, and exposure assessment.
Thank you, George. Jim Boylan.
Hi, everyone. Jim Boylan. I am the Assistant Branch Chief at Georgia Environmental Protection Division in the Air Protection Branch. My background includes ambient monitoring, emissions inventory development, modeling, and control strategy development. Thank you.
Thank you. Judy Chao.
Hi, everyone. I'm Judy Chao. I'm a research professor with Division of Atmospheric Sciences of Desert Research Institute. We are part of the university system of higher education in Nevada. My research interest has been on ambient monitoring, source characterization, composition analysis, and the receptor modeling and source apportionment.
Thank you. The next two members of the panel are not able to be here today, so I'll just mention them briefly. Dr. Debra Selecta is professor in Department of Environmental Medicine, School of Medicine and Dentistry at the University of Rochester. And Dr. Christina Fuller is associate professor in the Department of Population Health Sciences, Georgia State University School of Public Health in Atlanta. So next up is Philip Goodrum. Did I say that right?
Yes, good morning, Philip Goodrum. Hi, I am a principal toxicologist at GSI. I also teach as an adjunct at State University of New York, Environmental Science and Forestry on human health risk assessment. And my own research was on developing probabilistic methods to evaluate exposure and variability in the models that are used in a regulatory context. So I'm interested in the interplay between model-based estimates and empirical data. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Perry Gotsfield.
Yes, Perry Gotsfield, the Executive Director of Occupational Knowledge International. It's a nonprofit organization based in San Francisco, and we work internationally to build capacity around occupational and environmental health. My background and expertise around lead is involved in environmental testing, occupational assessments, and industrial hygiene. And I'm glad to be joining the panel this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. David Hens.
Hi, everyone. Davin Hensey from the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm in the Department of Mechanical Engineering, and I'm also an adjunct research scientist at Columbia University. My background is in air quality modeling and emissions estimation and source attribution for aerosols and reactive trace gases. This is my first engagement with the lead panel, but I have been and currently on the CASAC for the SOx/NOx secondary standard. Thank you.
Thank you. Howard Hu.
Hi, everybody. I'm Howard Hu. I'm the Thornton Chair and Professor in the Department of Population and Public Health Sciences at the University of Southern California. I'm a physician epidemiologist. I've been doing research on lead and environmental toxicants supported by NIH since 1991.
Thank you. Chris Johnson.
Hello, I'm Chris Johnson. I'm a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Syracuse University, currently on loan to the provost. I'm an associate provost for academic affairs at the moment. My research interests in lead are mostly in the area of terrestrial ecosystems, and in particular, the fate and transport of lead in soils. I served on the last panel and was a contributing author to the ISA in the cycle before that. So I've been with this program for quite some time. Thanks.
Thank you. Susan Couric.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm an environmental epidemiologist and physician on the faculty at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health in the Environmental Health Department and also in the Department of Medicine in the Harvard Medical School. My research interests are really focused on the relationship of contaminants, including lead, to child neurodevelopment. So I'm very involved in modeling lead-related human health impacts, especially in vulnerable populations. And I was involved in the previous CASAC Lead Review Panel.
Thank you. Bruce Lamphier.
Good morning. I'm a public health physician at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, British Columbia. And I've been doing lead research, beginning with what levels of lead in house dust are dangerous back in the mid-90s, and blood levels were coming down, and all of my advisors said I should get out of this line of research because there's not going to be any funding and the problem seems to be going away. So we started asking questions about are there effects at lower and lower levels, and began to focus on that as well as other health effects of toxic chemicals. Oh, and I was on the 2006, 2008 lead NACs as well.
Thank you. Joel Pounds.
Good morning. I'm Joel Pounds, recently retired from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory as a laboratory fellow. My research in lead has mainly involved investigating the cellular and molecular toxicity of lead, primarily in bone cells. Also the use and refinement of some computational models for lead.
Thank you. Brian Schwartz.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Brian Schwartz. I'm a professor in the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering at the Bloomberg School of Public Health of the Johns Hopkins University. I joined the faculty there in 1990, and I've spent my whole career there. I am a physician and an epidemiologist. I've led a number of NIH-funded studies of the health effects of lead, a number of different health outcomes, measuring chelatable lead, bone lead, blood lead, and it's been primarily in adults.
Thank you. William Stubblefield.
Good morning. I'm Bill Stubblefield. I'm a professor of environmental toxicology at Oregon State University in the Department of Environmental and Molecular Toxicology. My area of expertise relates to metals toxicology and metals risk assessment or environmental risk assessment. Done a fair bit of work in the area of bioavailability and development of water quality and soil and sediment standards throughout the world. My previous experience with the lead group has gone back to early 2010, 2011, somewhere in that range. I'm happy to participate in this exercise, and it's actually good to see several of you I haven't seen in quite some time.
Thank you. Brisa Sanchez.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Brisa Sanchez. I am a Thornton Professor of Biostatistics at Drexel University. My expertise is in the development and applications of statistical models for the study of environmental exposure assessment, including measurement error and evaluation of health effects from the environment, broadly defined, as well as health disparities. I have extensive collaborations in evaluating associations of lead and health outcomes, particularly long-term lead exposure and child development. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you and seeing all the faces to all the papers that we cite in our many papers. Thank you.
Thank you. Cathleen Vork. Kathy Vork.
Good morning. I'm humbled to be in the group of such distinguished panel members. I'm a staff toxicologist at the California Environmental Protection Agency Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, Air Toxicology and Risk Assessment section. My focus of my work has been on occupational exposures to lead, and particularly doing PBPK modeling alongside of deposition clearance modeling. And I have also served on lead EPA panels since 2014.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Mark Weisskopf.
Hi, I'm Mark Weisskopf. I'm a professor of environmental health and epidemiology at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. I am a neuroscientist and an epidemiologist by training, and since my early epidemiology days have been working with lead, as well as other toxicants, and I look at how they affect brain function across the life course, not just metals and lead, but other toxicants as well. A while back, I'm not actually remembering the specific date, I helped out on the adult cognitive function and lead aspects for a prior ISA, and was just on the PM panel a few months ago. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you everybody for joining and for your service to EPA. So now I'll briefly review the agenda. First, we'll invite the EPA to give their presentation on the integrated review plan. We'll follow this up with clarifying questions from the panel. As Aaron said, there's no public commenters, so then we'll move into the public discussion, the panel discussion, excuse me, of volume 2 of the integrated review plan. We'll start with chapter 2, followed by chapter 3. There are no assigned lead discussants in this consultation, so I invite the panelists to raise your hands when you wish to speak. It's important that we bring up key points that you want to make and that you've made in your individual comments in public. However, you don't need to read your comments in full or mention minor points. So now, with that, I wish to turn the meeting over to Erica Sasser and EPA to both introduce themselves and to give their presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shepard. I am Erica Sasser, and I am in EPA's Office of Air and Radiation. So my team is responsible for the regulatory and policy sides of the lead NACs and all the NACs, actually. So we work closely with ORD, and this afternoon, ORD and I will be offering you a joint presentation. And I will introduce other folks in just a moment. First, let me say that I am extremely happy to be back with the CASAC. We thank the CASAC for their letter to us on the on the PM review that we just received a couple of weeks ago. We really appreciate the very rapid work on the PM review. And we look forward now to turning our attention to lead beginning today. And I want to thank the CASAC and also welcome all of the members of the lead panel. We are extremely grateful for your willingness to serve the agency in this capacity. We know it's very time consuming, and we look forward to your expertise and to benefiting from your comments over the next couple of years. So thank you in advance for all the work that we know you will do. Let me start with some broader introductions before we get into the presentation. I would like to, can we go to this next slide, please? Thank you. So as I said, I'm the director of the Health and Environmental Impacts Division. This slide shows you there's a little cheat sheet here in the blue box that helps you decipher all the acronyms. But there are two main offices here. You have the Office of Air and Radiation and the Office of Research and Development. And you will be hearing in turn from those two offices today. So after I do some introductory remarks and some orientation towards the process, you will hear from Deirdre Murphy, who is the staff lead on lead and has been the staff lead on lead for a while. Many of you know her, and she will be with us throughout this review. So you will be hearing from her frequently. We also have with us several colleagues from ORD who will be speaking. Steve Dutton, who is the director of the Health and Environmental Effects Assessment Division, as well as Evan Kaufman and Meredith Lassiter, who are the staff leads on the ORD side for the integrated science assessment. And then in addition, many of you already know Karen Wesson, who is the ambient standards group leader. She will be, I'm sure, chiming in at various points, as well as Emily Snyder, Chris Weaver from ORD, and then Sheila Igo and David Orland from our Office of General Counsel. We could not do this without our lawyers. All things at EPA. So those are the main folks you will hear from today, and we are at your disposal. So as you have questions, we hope that you will please ask them, because the experts here can answer many of them up front. So please just ask us if you have a question. And with that, let me go on to some basic background. So we're here today to really discuss in depth Volume 2 of the Integrated Review Plan. But in order to set the stage for that, we want to first provide a little background on the NACS process itself and the statute, the requirements that we are working within as we go through this process, and then talk a little bit about some recent improvements in efficiency that we have tried to introduce into the way we approach the NACS reviews. And you're experiencing the fruits of one of those investments today in the new format for the integrated review plan. So we'll talk a little bit about the changes we're making and why, and then we will get into the meat of the actual review plan. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so for many of you, I know this is a repeat because you have been through this process before, but some of you may not be as familiar with the NAAQS process, and some of you may find this a helpful reminder. Of course, under this program, we have 6 pollutants, and in spite of that small number, we are constantly busy trying to keep up with the reviews. And the Clean Air Act requires that we set both primary and secondary standards, so both health-based and welfare-based standards for all of these pollutants. In doing so, we assess first the air quality criteria, which refer to the latest scientific knowledge useful in indicating both the kind and the extent of the effects on public health and welfare, which might be expected from the presence of the pollutant in ambient air. And then the standards themselves. Of course, the second part of it is the standards. So when we think about the standards, what we're trying to evaluate is, are the existing standards requisite? If we were to just be meeting the standards that are currently in place, what is the public health burden? And is that sufficiently protective? And it's essentially the same question on the welfare side. If we were just meeting the standards, would that be sufficiently protective against public welfare effects? The Clean Air Act does not require that we eliminate all risk. So that's not the goal. The goal is to determine what is actually requisite with an adequate margin of safety. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. So we have some guidance from the courts. Of course, the NAAQS program has been subject to a great deal of litigation over a great many years. And some of those decisions have provided really important guideposts for us in thinking about how to translate the evidence that we have into standards. First, the court has told us that we are required to engage in reasoned decision-making, which means that we have to consider relevant scientific fact and relevant scientific uncertainty. EPA may also not consider cost in setting these standards. So the role of cost comes after we determine what's requisite as we move into the implementation phase. And we are supposed to review the scientific information or the criteria, as well as the standards for each pollutant every 5 years. And of course, your role is to help us through that review process. Next slide, thank you. So the primary or health-based standards, the Clean Air Act says that they must be standards that, in the judgment of the administrator, are requisite to protect public health with an adequate margin of safety. So the concept of adequate margin of safety is intended to address uncertainties. We know that the evidence, even if it's extremely strong, will still have aspects of uncertainty. And the margin of safety is intended to help address that and to provide a degree of protection against hazards that research may not yet have identified. In addressing these requirements, we consider several factors, including the nature of the health effects in question, the size of the populations at risk and their estimated exposure to the pollutant, and the degree of scientific uncertainty related to the potential occurrence of such effects. And we are thinking about public health protection, not just for the average person, but for at-risk groups. So we're looking at adverse impacts on the population broadly, and in particular, those who may be most susceptible or vulnerable to adverse effects occurring due to their underlying health conditions or their stage of life or other factors that may make them at risk. On the secondary side, again, this is left to the judgment of the administrator, but the standards are intended to be requisite to protect public welfare from any known or anticipated adverse effect associated with the presence of the pollutant in ambient air. And the Clean Air Act specifies a very broad array of welfare effects that we are considering. So that is soils, water, crops, vegetation, materials, animals, wildlife, weather, visibility, and climate. Depends on which pollutant we're reviewing. Usually there are some of these that are more relevant than others, but it is a very wide set of effects that we are looking at. And one of the aspects of the secondary standards that is particularly important and sometimes troublesome is that determining what constitutes an adverse effect to public welfare can often be tricky, can be not as straightforward as what we might see on the health side, where adverse health impacts are generally fairly well understood. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the review process itself, and I'm not going to get too bogged down into the details because, again, many of you know this, but this diagram you'll see several times during the course of the review. It just is an outline of the various stages of the review. And the first phase, which is where we are now, is the planning phase. So in June of 2020, we issued a call for information, and we are now at a point where we are going to begin. We did not have a workshop, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as we talk about process improvements. We've moved into the planning phase, and we are working on the early stages of the integrated science assessment. So we will move from this planning phase into the integrated science assessment, and then the risk and exposure analyses and the policy assessment. And those two phases in green are the phases where the CASAC will be providing advice to the agency. Throughout the process, we also solicit public comment. We want to be sure that we are being as open and transparent as we can as we present the information. Rulemaking phase in blue, I think the next slide talks about that one. Remember correctly? Oh, well, there is a slide, I think it might be further on. All right, well, let me back up again then. Let's talk about the assessments. I'm sorry, you can go to the next slide, but I'm going to talk first a little bit more about those two green boxes, and then we'll get to the blue box. So the integrated science assessment, which Steve Dutton will talk more about in just a moment, is intended to be a very comprehensive evaluation of the science. And for that reason, it's often very lengthy. And one of the core functions of the ISA is to synthesize the information. So not just to gather it, but actually to knit it together into a story about what are the strengths of the evidence, what are the uncertainties, and given all of the different types of information that we have, what conclusions can we draw about the causality of the relationship between lead and health and welfare effects? The ISA also looks carefully at evidence for impacts on at-risk populations and assesses where we have dose response information that can be applied. That's particularly important for our understanding of the level of the standard and also any quantitative assessments that we might do. So the next phase is what we consider the sort of policy assessment phase. As part of that, we typically do quantitative risk assessments or risk and exposure assessments, depending on the pollutant. The exact nature of the quantitative analysis depends on the pollutant in question. For lead, we definitely anticipate doing quantitative work, which would be presented to you in a subsequent document. And the results of those quantitative assessments are sometimes presented as a standalone document and sometimes integrated into the policy assessment. And again, this is a place that we have tried to improve efficiency over time by making sure that the information is couched in the appropriate policy context. The policy assessment is intended to help bridge the gap between the scientific information, the quantitative assessments, and the judgment that the administrator must ultimately exercise in determining whether to retain or revise the standards. So it is intended to help channel the information into a decision-relevant framework and to help identify any potential adjustments to the standards that might be necessary. And of course, on all of these documents, we are seeking your advice, your input, and your counsel, and ultimately your advice to the administrator on the standards themselves. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the slide I was thinking of earlier. This is the rulemaking slide. This corresponds to the blue box on that previous diagram. This is occurring essentially after the CASAC engagement is finished. So after we get your final letter on the policy assessment, we would embark upon rulemaking phase. That is a very standard process for us, involving a proposal that goes through interagency review, public comment, public hearings, and ultimately is finalized in a final decision notice. And these decisions, of course, reflect your input, the conclusions in the policy assessment, as well as any public comments we get throughout the process. Next slide, please. Okay, I referenced earlier that we are making some improvements to the NACS process. And I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on this, except that it is relevant to our discussion today, because one of the areas that, so over time, the NACS program has matured. And as it matures, and as we go through these reviews, we learn things about what types of approaches are most effective. And we learn that not all pollutants are the same. So in some cases, it makes sense to tailor the review to a particular pollutant, depending on the volume of information, depending on the degree of quantitative analyses that we might want to do. And there are some places where, as a team, as a staff team in EPA, we have realized that we could gain efficiency. And so about 2 years ago, we initiated a process to try to narrow down a couple of areas where we could really make investments to improve efficiency. And we identified the 4 things that you see listed here. And we did this by sort of mapping the process that we used to follow and then trying to figure out what are the opportunities within that process to change the way we're doing things and make some improvements. So one of them is the idea of evergreening the process by which we search for literature, so that there isn't a gap between the start of a review and the time where we can really begin working on the integrated science assessment. And I think lead is a great example of where this has been an enormous process for ORD, and Steve can talk about this, just to try to gather the literature that's relevant for inclusion in the ISA. So we realize that's a place where a more evergreen literature review process might help us save time. Another area is making sure that we are up to date on the air quality information. EPA assesses air quality information for lots of reasons. We do it routinely, and we feel that there's a way to incorporate that routine assessment more efficiently into the NACS process. We also think that some closer integration between the quantitative assessments and the policy assessment are a good idea. And we will be talking more about that as we make decisions in this review. We'll be looking for your input on that. But essentially, the idea is the quantitative analyses are best housed within the policy framework that we will ultimately be using to judge the standards. So the closer we can knit the quantitative analyses with the policy assessment, the easier it is for you and ultimately for the administrator to make recommendations about what you think makes sense with regard to the standards. And finally, we have many ideas about ways to enhance engagement with the CASAC, including through more upfront engagement and orientation, which we are doing in part today to make sure that we are delivering everything you need to do your job efficiently. So one of the other changes that we have thought might be important, in part to get more timely input from the CASAC, is this new format for the IRP, which is a 3-volume format. This is the first time we're trying this approach, and we appreciate your feedback on how well it works for you. The goal here is that Volume 1 is a background document. It houses the history that is relevant and useful, but it is essentially an encapsulation of something that has already happened. So it's not really something that needs review. It's there for your reference in your background. Volume 2 is really where we're beginning to seek your input. Volume 2 lays out the plan for the review and the plan for the integrated science assessment. And that is where today we are seeking your consultation and advice. It includes the policy relevant issues and specific questions pertaining to the integrated science assessment. And then volume 3, which will be subject of a future consultation, will focus on the quantitative analyses that we may incorporate into the review, where we definitely want your input as well. Okay, so this is just a schedule of the review, and as I said, July 2020 was the call for information, and we are here now with the integrated review plan. You will see that draft ISA is targeted for early next year. At the time we have the discussion with you on the ISA, we would also want to have a consultation on volume 3 of the integrated review plan. So the idea is you will have the science assessment in front of you, and with that, you can help advise us on the quantitative assessment plan that we would then embark on moving forward from that stage. And then you can see we move fairly quickly through the remaining stages to try to finalize all those documents, including the policy assessment, and get to the point of proposed and final rulemakings. So I've just said a lot. Which I hope was useful to some of you. I hope it wasn't too much for those of you who have heard this before. And I may just pause. I'm going to turn the mic over now to Deirdre Murphy, who will be talking specifically about the integrated review plan. If there are any questions that we can address before that, maybe folks can just raise their hand.
Go ahead, Bruce.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Leanne. I just had a question about when, as we're thinking on about the ISA, if there's new science that is not yet published, maybe it's in a report that's been peer reviewed but not yet published in more typical peer reviewed journals. Is there a point at which the ISA will be closed and we won't consider new studies?
Yes, there would be a point. I'm going to ask Steve Dutton if he wants to take that question. I'm not sure if we know what that date is yet.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, we do typically have what we call a literature cutoff date. That would be kind of the last date that we scan the literature to incorporate into the integrated science assessment. We haven't established that date at this point. It would be, as you can probably imagine, it takes a while to get through the enormous amount of literature. So it would be quite a few months before we release the ISA that we would define that cutoff date. And typically we do require, especially in an instance like this where we have very data-rich assessment, we do require that the material be fully published before we include it in the ISA. There are times when studies come out that CASAC can recommend to us for inclusion at subsequent steps in the process. So it's definitely worthwhile to raise any studies that you're aware of now that may be coming out or that are published that we may not have captured. And that's an important part of CASAC's role.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question? I have a question while we see if there's other hands, and that is it realistic to publish the volume 3 IRP in early 2023 and have the policy assessment done by the fall of that same year? That seems like a pretty short turnaround.
Well, we are always ambitious. We sometimes have to adjust that. And of course, the input that we get from you, and particularly your advice on the quantitative assessment plan, could affect that timeline. Or if there was some major shift in your advice on the ISA, and we had to go back and do more work there. There are lots of reasons why this schedule could change, but we wanted to give you a sense of our goal.
Great, thank you. George.
Kind of a related question. The last few years have been a little, how shall we say, different for CASAC reviews, but going back, further back, it's not unusual to have a second draft of a document, ISA or PA, and occasionally there have been third drafts. That hasn't been happening recently because of the accelerated timelines. Are we back to more of a business as usual where the schedule could accommodate more than a single draft of any of these documents?
I think my answer to that would be that if the CASAC and the panel feel that there are fundamental deficiencies in these documents that cannot be rectified without another draft, then we would be open to another draft. What we would ask is if it's things that we can fix in the final document that you are confident that we can address, then there might not be a need for another draft, which is another burden for you as well as for us, and we could move to final. But there's no hard and fast rule about what's appropriate in a given review.
Okay, thank you. I think
Do an A+ job, but we may miss the mark.
No. It's as I recall, it's kind of been CASAC at the end of conclusion of a set review of a document, decides, yeah, we're good with it with the changes we've suggested, or no, we want to see another draft. So I think that decision ultimately lies with the CASAC and the panel. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Bill Stubblefield.
Just turn the mute off. Thank you very much. Nice presentation, Eric. I had a quick question for you, though, that I've wondered about. In the process of our review of the data and EPA's review of the data, so to speak, it's kind of a retrospective sort of activity in terms of you look what data is available and then you assess the quality of it and you move forward with recommendations. But the question I've always had is there a role for this body to provide guidance back to the agency to identify basically holes in the data and research that is still wanting, and to propose places where the agency may want to seek additional data, gather additional data, et cetera?
Yes, indeed there is. I think that is always, it is part of the charge to the CASAC, and usually comes a little bit later in the process, but it is one of the key things that we ask for you to advise us on so that we can target our own research appropriately moving forward, and also ensure that we are signaling to the outside world what gaps might be fruitful to work on for future reviews.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. I think we can move on now.
Okay, thank you. My name is Deirdre Murphy. As Erica introduced, I'm the staff lead on the NAAQS review for the Office of Air and Radiation in EPA. And I'm just going to walk through a handful of slides with some background on the lead NAAQS and on issues that have been important in lead NAAQS reviews. Most of which is touched on to either greater or lesser detail in Volume 1 that Erica mentioned, our background document. So on this slide, it's just simply for those of you who are less familiar with the lead standards, it tells you their genesis. So in 1976, the first step occurred, which was to identify lead as a criteria air pollutant. And then 2 years later, the first standards were established for lead. The first review of the standards occurred in the latter half of the 1980s, with the result being a decision not to revise those standards. At that time, there was attention on implementing the standards. A lot of the areas of the country were not in attainment. So a strategy that the agency put out in 1991 went at a lot of areas that the agency had programs for to improve the situation with regard to lead, including enforcement of that existing NAAQS. The next review of the standard occurred in 2005 to 2008. That review was completed in November 2008 with a conclusion that a substantial revision was needed to those standards. And you can see from the rightmost column in this table that when they were set in 1978, both standards were set at a level of 1.5 microgram per meter cubed lead in total suspended particles. And that level was revised and lowered by an order of magnitude with that 2008 decision. The indicator for the standard remained the same, that's lead in total suspended particles. The form for the standard was additionally revised. The original form for the standard was a simple average of lead measurements across a calendar quarter, meaning all the measurements from January to March or all the measurements from April to June were averaged. The change to the standard, which occurred in 2008 in terms of the form, was to require that first the measurements within a month were averaged and then 3 consecutive months were averaged to create a 3-month average. And therefore we had 12 different averages to compare to the standard within a year rather than 4. So that was another way that the standard was tightened at that time. The last review of the standard occurred in 2016 with the conclusion that the existing standards provided the requisite protection of public health and public welfare, and those standards were retained without revision. Next slide. So this slide summarizes just some of the key policy aspects in LEDNAC's reviews, many of which are elementary and no-brainers for all, but some are just emphasized here as things that we're aware of and in the top of our head in some reviews. So lead, of course, is a naturally occurring metal. Its uses contribute to its environmental distribution. On a national scale, the largest sources of emissions to ambient air come from the use of leaded aviation fuel that's used in piston-driven aircraft. Locally, however, the highest concentrations of lead in ambient air occur near metal industries, such as battery recyclers or metal smelting and mining activities. Lead is a multimedia pollutant with the air emissions distributing to other media. Generally, of course, human exposures are dominated by the ingestion route, specifically via indoor dust. Also, children are generally more likely to be exposed to lead because of the hand-to-mouth activity and contact with dust and lead on surfaces. Lead exposures unrelated to air are many and include lead-based paint, lead from drinking water distributions, etc. I'm sure you all are quite familiar with those. Lastly, lead emitted in the past can remain available for environmental or human exposure for an extended time in some areas, posing complications to our consideration of the exposures associated with the current lead standards. Next slide. So this slide provides an illustration of one aspect of this complication. This figure comes from the last ISA from 2013, and it presents NHANES data for different birth cohorts. Numerous observations can be drawn the more you stare at this slide, including the most obvious, that blood concentrations at all ages have dropped significantly over the past several decades. Additionally, blood lead concentrations in today's adults and older children even continue to reflect the higher exposures of the past. Next slide. With regard to air lead concentrations, this slide presents the national trend in concentrations over the last 10 years. And this is at sites that are have been continuously monitored over that time period. And it indicates what I think most folks are aware of, that the levels of air lead continue to decline or have over the last 10 years. Next slide. So with regard to the existing standards, as I mentioned, both the primary and secondary standards are set at 0.15 microgram per meter cubed. And at the time, in the last review that was completed in 2016, the decision was to retain these standards, which were established in 2008. And at that time, the primary standard had been substantially revised, lowering that level from the previous level of 1.5. And that revision was based on consideration of neurological effects in young children. And that continued to be the attention or the primary area of consideration in the 2016 review. The decision both in 2008 and in 2016 was informed by consideration of an evidence-based framework that considered relationships between air lead and blood lead and relationships between blood lead and IQ response. The secondary standard was also set equal to the revised primary standard because data were lacking to provide a basis for setting a distinct secondary standard. And that remained true in the 2016 review. The standard that is set is intended to protect against adverse environmental effects, particularly in terrestrial and sediment-dwelling organisms. Also, with the 2008 decision, monitoring requirements were substantially strengthened, particularly by adding new requirements near sources of lead to ensure that we were monitoring areas with the potential to exceed the NAAQS. Next slide, please. So in volume 2 of the IRP, which is in front of you for conversation today, chapter 2 focuses on the overall planning for the review as Erica described. And as she mentioned, the policy assessment is intended to provide a transparent evaluation of policy implications of the currently available scientific information and quantitative analyses for consideration by the agency in decision-making on the NAAQS. Included in this review in this document are the policy relevant questions. And the policy assessment is organized around this set of policy relevant questions, which include the overarching question for each review. Do the currently available scientific evidence and exposure and risk-based information support or call into question the adequacy of the public health and public welfare protection afforded by the current primary and current secondary standards? The PA addresses this question through consideration and discussion of a series of sub-questions, including, does the newly available evidence alter our understanding of the health or welfare effects of the at-risk populations or ecosystems, of exposures of potential concern? And of course, are previously identified uncertainties reduced? Do some remain that are important? Are there new ones? And then additionally, with regard to the quantitative analyses, what are the nature and magnitude of lead exposures and associated health or welfare risks under air quality conditions meeting the current NAAQS? And to what extent are the estimates reasonably judged important from a public health or a public welfare perspective? And of course, what are the important uncertainties and limitations associated with these estimates and these analyses? Lastly, review of the draft PA, which as you heard is targeted for late 2023. Review of that document is then facilitating the provision of advice from CASAC to the agency on the adequacy of the standards, because that document will include preliminary conclusions in that regard. And I also wanted to mention with regard to the last question on research needs that one section of the policy assessment also focuses on the issue of areas of uncertainty in the evidence and what areas should be targeted for new research, new data collection efforts. So that's definitely part of what we're interested in the advice from the panel on when we get to the draft policy assessment. So that's the last slide I have. I would intend to turn it over to Dr. Steve Dutton, unless there are any questions on the material that I just went through.
Anyone on the panel have any questions? Bruce.
Yeah, thank you, Deirdre. You mentioned in 2016 that the monitoring requirements were strengthened. Are they still relying entirely on TSP, or has PM10, PM 2.5 monitoring been done for lead?
So let me just clarify. The strengthening of the monitoring requirements were with the 2008 rulemaking when we did a variety of things. But in both reviews, both in 2008 and 2010, there was consideration of the appropriate indicator for the standard. It remains lead in total suspended particles. And you may recall, as being a member of the CASAC panel back in that 2008 review, we considered explicitly at that time whether it might be appropriate to modify the indicator to be lead in smaller particles like PM10. And based on the information available, it was not clear that we could have a consistently be able to estimate what the total lead would be that would obviously contribute to blood lead concentrations. So the decision was made not to modify the indicator to a different size fraction, because you get various relationships between lead in TSP and lead in PM10, whether you're near sources and depending on what type of source it is. So we've stuck with the lead in total suspended particles. Although there is an option in the lead monitoring requirements that if it's an area that is not near a source, I believe that, and it can be demonstrated that lead in PM10 is sufficient to show, that meeting or compliance with the standard, that can be substituted in some cases. Does that address your question?
I think so. So maybe this is a related question. For all the monitoring that's currently being done, because I think also 2006, 2008, we talked about the need to investigate the relationship with smaller particles. Do we have more data now on PM10, PM2.5 lead, airborne lead from the monitoring and blood lead levels, or are we still predominantly TSP?
Well, that will be a good question for the new ISA, I believe, Dr. Lamphier. I will say that in the 2016 review, we did have more information, and that was summarized in the 2013 ISA. There were a couple of publications specifically looking at relationships among size fractions with regard to lead. So I think some information continues to be amassed, but I'm not sure what there is that will be summarized in the next ISA.
Thank you.
Howard.
Yeah, for those of us on the human health epidemiology side of things, it would be helpful to see the current assumptions made regarding the quantitative relationship between air lead levels and blood lead levels. Do you have something that you can post during the meeting?
No, I don't have something to post during the meeting, but I can point you to a couple of sources. And we can send information to you all so that you're well versed for the next interaction. But the most recent, the last rulemaking, the last policy assessment, all would include tables that identify what the key studies have been that looked at those relationships, either in the, in the 2016 review, we relied on the 2013 ISA. And so out of that 2013 ISA, we identified what were the key studies that looked at relationships between lead in air and lead in children's blood lead. And the focus was on young children. And so those relationships, ratios, we called them, were teed up. And the framework that I alluded to, which was informed the setting of the level and the review of the level in 2016, then looked across those that array of studies and what the estimates were from them. So I'm sorry, Dr. Hugh, I don't have something I can flash up right now. I wasn't prepared for that particular focus.
Thank you, Judy.
Yeah. You mentioned that human exposure dominated by ingestion rot, and then you give example indoor dust, and actually there's lots of hand to mouth, like you mentioned, the children dust. Have EPA, and along with what Howard mentioned about the association between the air lead and blood lead level, I wonder, have the past review or EPA ever considered to different form of the standard, different type, different indicator? Because there's not much lead monitoring, as you show, and the level has been really going down, but that not necessarily means the lead in the neural system has been going down.
So by different indicator, Dr. Chao, do you mean other than lead in air?
Yeah.
Oh, that's an interesting thought. An air standard that is not in air. Interesting thought. I don't believe we have not explicitly considered that. No. I'm not sure if OGC, if our legal counsel has a comment on that, but I believe this standard is intended to be focused on air. I'm not sure how creative we can be.
Yeah, this is Sheila Igo. I think I think there would be a concern with a standard that is not based on lead in the ambient air, given the way the statutory language reads.
All right, thank you. It looks like we don't have any more hands up, so maybe we want to move on in the presentation
to Dr. Dutton.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Debra. Welcome, everybody. I just want to echo all the appreciation you heard from the speakers for the time and effort that you're all putting into reviewing our documents. As Erica mentioned, we recognize what a commitment this is, but the impact it has on our final documents and decisions is invaluable to us. So appreciate all the time and effort you're putting into this. I am Steve Dutton. I am the director of the Health and Environmental Effects Assessment Division, which is in EPA's Office of Research and Development. And I am joined on the call this morning by our two leads, staff leads, Evan Kaufman, who is focusing on the health side, and Meredith Lassiter, who is our staff lead on the welfare side. And when I have about 5 or 6 slides here, I'll go through. At the end of that, I'll ask them to pop on their cameras because they'll be available here on the call for us, for you to ask any questions and answer those questions. Also, listening in intently, we have a very large team of multiple experts who it takes to put together these incredibly large and comprehensive documents. And so they're all listening intently as well. So I'm going to speak just for a little bit here about the integrated science assessment. So the integrated science assessment is the document that we produce that contains the scientific basis for the review of each NACS. In the word of the language of the Clean Air Act, it lays out the criteria for the review. And the integrated science assessments are intended to be a comprehensive but also concise evaluation to the extent we can make them concise, focusing on the real policy relevant questions that you heard from Deirdre just a moment ago. And that information is intended to be adequate to support the NACS review process and provides the scientific foundation for each NACS review. As you can imagine, for some of these criteria pollutants, lead being one of the largest in terms of evidence base, it is a significant challenge to get through the amount of literature that is available out there. And lead has its own specific challenge in that lead is not a very specific term. It's really hard to design literature search strategies to capture the appropriate lead information for advising us to informing decisions on the lead air quality standards. So what we do in the ISA is we develop a process for gathering that literature that will help us inform the standard setting process. And the question we're looking to address is there an independent effect of lead on the health and welfare effects of at relevant ambient concentrations? And to help guide our collection of the literature, we use a couple of approaches, customized for our human health and our ecological effects. So in human health, we develop what is referred to as a PICOS statement. This is a kind of common practice used in the systematic review literature. It's a kind of a structured framework for identifying the type of information that will be included in an assessment. PICOS stands for population, exposure, comparison, outcome, and study design. So it's really just a mnemonic for the type of information and that we're looking for in the literature. And it is used as a guide for our literature identification and search strategy that we establish upfront, the criteria we use for including or excluding studies, the type of data that we extract from those studies, and ultimately how that information will be pulled together into our integration and synthesis of the results. We have, with this review, actually developed a new but analogous approach for our ecological effects. We're calling it a LECES statement. It's essentially the same thing as the PICOS, although we are using more ecologically appropriate terminology. So instead of looking at population, what we look at, the term we use, the level of biological organization. And that's often how we will organize the information in our assessments, is by that level of biological organization. Then we predefine our exposure and comparisons, and then we use the term endpoint instead of outcome because that is more commonly encountered in the ecological literature, and then study design. So again, just like the health side, the LISES is designed to help guide our selection of literature for inclusion on the ecological and welfare endpoints. Next slide, please. So the integrated science assessments gather a tremendous amount of literature from a broad range of health and welfare disciplines. This slide right here is illustrative of our health evidence that we gather, and there would be a similar analogy on the eco-welfare side. So the ISAs organize our relevant literature from a very broad health outcome categories. These are then, we evaluate these studies following our PICOS approach, characterize the results, and extract relevant data for inclusion in the integrated science assessment. We then integrate this evidence across these disciplines and health outcome categories to develop our kind of bottom line summary statements. These are our causality determinations, and I'll talk about those in the next slide. The evidence we gather comes from a huge range of backgrounds, including epidemiology, animal toxicology, controlled human exposure, dosimetry, and then we add in exposure science and atmospheric chemistry to round out our evidence base that leads into our causal determinations. In addition, as was mentioned earlier in the presentation, we do an additional evaluation of evidence that may be relevant to populations potentially at increased risk. And this spans all these different disciplines. So you have a comparable approach on the welfare side, on the eco and welfare side, where we are gathering evidence base for assessing our terrestrial and aquatic effects from many different disciplines, including soil science, environmental chemistry, microbiology, ecotoxicology, plant and animal physiology, behavioral and population biology, and community ecology, as well as our exposure science and atmospheric chemistry are tied together to develop our causal determinations on the eco and welfare side. Go to the next slide. I can talk a little bit about the framework that we have developed for reaching these causality determinations. So we, over the last dozen or so years, have been working to promote or develop a framework which promotes consistency and transparency in our approach between different NAAQS reviews. This framework was developed with a tremendous amount of input and guidance from the CASAC and the public in the early years of developing the integrated science assessments. And around 2015, that framework had matured to a point where we pulled it out and published it as a standalone companion document referred to as the preamble to the ISA. So that document that you have available to you describes this process, or the process for developing an ISA, as well as the framework for causality determinations. Our framework emphasizes the synthesis of evidence across disciplines. So it's not just focusing on one discipline, it's really looking across these disciplines. And it has a 5-tier, 5 different categories that we reach in terms of the causal determination. They range from causal relationship to a likely to be causal relationship, suggestive of but not sufficient to infer a causal relationship, inadequate to infer a causal relationship, and not likely to be a causal relationship. So those are the 5 categories that we end up with in our conclusions. The ISA preamble again describes this framework in detail. And I should mention, since many of you were involved in the PM NAAQS review, or continue to be involved in the PM NAAQS review, there's discussion about a National Academy of Sciences and Medicine, Engineering and Medicine study, or NASEM study that we have underway right now. to evaluate available frameworks that are out there for evaluating a multidisciplinary evidence base similar to what we addressed in the NACS. That study is underway. We didn't describe it in any way in the integrated review plan since we don't have those recommendations from the nascent study. But once those become available to us later this summer, that we will be incorporating any advice we get from NASEM, in addition to advice we receive from CASAC, into this review and future reviews as is appropriate to continuously improve our approach and our process. If we jump to the next slide, this is just meant to kind of give you a sense of the framework that we have and those 5 categories. We have a descriptive the description of what it takes to get into each of these causal categories for both health effects and our eco and welfare effects. For the causal relationship, we really are looking for multiple high quality studies that rule out chance compounding and other biases with reasonable confidence. For our likely to be causal relationship, we have, again, multiple high quality studies, but there might be important uncertainties that remain. For suggestive, the evidence is suggestive, but limited in relation to causality. For inadequate, we find that there's evidence, the evidence is insufficient quality, quantity, consistency, or power to draw a conclusion. And for our not likely category, there are multiple studies showing that there's no effect across the exposure concentrations of interest. And again, this is all described in the preamble to the ISA. The last 2 slides I have here really just show the organization of the Integrated Review Plan, Volume 2. So if we can jump to the next slide, starting out with Chapter 2, as Deirdre mentioned, it includes our key policy relevant issues for the current review, focusing on the primary standard and the secondary standard, trying to identify key policy relevant issues and general approaches for the review and the basis for the current standards in sections 2.1 through 2.2. And then if we jump to the next slide, it talks about the organization of Chapter 3. And this is all about development of the integrated science assessment that I just described to you. And we have Volume 2, Chapter 3 organized in the manner shown here. So Section 3.1 is our organization of the ISA, and that's how we are starting to pull our material together and how we intend to organize it in the draft document that will be released later this or early next year for CASAC review. The Section 3.2 describes the overall scope and focus of the ISA, and that's where we talk about these PICOS and LISI statements. Section 3.3 has our specific science questions that we are hoping to address in this review and in the integrated science assessment. These have some topic specific questions, as well as questions relating to the evidence that will help us with our causality determinations, and then other scientific questions that we have to address key scientific uncertainties or limitations in both the health and ecological evidence. So that rounds out the presentation here. I would ask if we have a moment, if we could have Evan Kaufman and Meredith Lassiter throw on their cameras real quick and introduce themselves just so you can put a face to the name as we answer some of your questions. So let me start with Evan since I see you here.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Hi, my name is Evan Kaufman, and I'm an epidemiologist with the Office of Research and Development. As Steve mentioned, I'm the staff health lead for the LEAD ISA. So it's nice to virtually meet everyone, and I'm looking forward to listening to your discussion today.
Thank you, Evan. Ms. Meredith, are you available?
Yes, I'm on.
Great. Great.
Yes, as Steve mentioned, I'm an ecologist with the Office of Research and Development and the co-lead on the LEAD ISA.
Great. thank you, Evan and Meredith. And we're all here and available to answer questions. So I think I'll hand it back to Leanne.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to everybody from EPA for your very clear and thorough presentation. I think that was very helpful. Even if for some of us, some of it's a lot of review, but still it's good to have that context. Howard, you have your hand up.
Yeah, for those of us outside of government who've been reading the literature, we've been following, some of us have been following closely the process of developing environmental versions of the grade process. As I'm sure you know, there's Chris Thayer in the IRIS office and others at the National Toxicology Program have been involved in that. How would you say the current process that we're expected to go through will relate to the criteria that the grade process has already established for determining weight of evidence and causality?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And yes, we work very closely with Chris Thayer. She's leads the IRIS program here, and the office is just down the hall from me, so we work very closely with her. We have, in our Center for Public Health and Environmental Assessment, we have a range of assessment products, and each has a related but slightly different approach for gathering and assessing our evidence based on the needs and the kind of the availability of literature for those different assessment products. Certainly grade is a well-established approach as well, very related in ways, but different in other ways to the approach that we use in the integrated science assessment program. I think probably the biggest difference between what is done in grade and what we do in the integrated science assessment is sort of the approach we use at those last steps for determining the causality, where we're kind of looking across these various ranges of scientific information and trying to tie together both the health, ecology, on the health side, the epidemiology, the controlled human exposure, and the toxicology evidence, and then again, similarly on the welfare side. In order to help inform our causal conclusions and decisions, we have developed this framework to really allow us to tap into those different evidence lines. It's not a kind of easy process by any means to try and ensure that we have this consistency across different evidence bases. We're looking for both the associations and on the epidemiology side, but also trying to tie that in with biological plausibility. Does it make sense that we're seeing these kind of associations from our tox evidence? I'll see if Evan or Meredith has anything else they'd like to add to that, the approach being used here.
Nothing for me, Steve. I think that captured it well. Thank you.
Okay. And certainly I think to answer your question, one of the things we will be looking for from the NASEM study that we paneled is to get some advice on how is there information we can gain from these other multidisciplinary frameworks that are out there, knowing that ours is not the only one, to help improve our process.
I guess just to follow up on that, given that the grade process itself has been peer reviewed, how would you characterize the process that IRIS finally goes through for the public? Would you say that it's even more stringent, or it's just different, or I think it'll be important to be able to communicate how it's different from that's been published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature.
Yeah, I would say both are equally rigorous. I don't want to speak so much to the IRIS process here, since that's not my area. That would be Chris Thayer, who could speak to us very eloquently about the IRIS process and how that's approached. But both are very, I would say, equally rigorous and based on extensive input from experts in the field, as well as panels such as the CASAC here today and the public, and designed for their kind of fit for purpose or designed for their intended purposes. In the case of the integrated science assessments, we are fortunate to be on the data-rich side of things. Sometimes that's a benefit. Sometimes it can be a burden to try and get through the amount of evidence that we have and consolidate it in a sort of comprehensive yet concise manner. So we've really designed our framework to help us in sort of addressing that more data-rich, nationally representative data set that we have.
Thank you. So I think it looks, unless there are any additional clarifying questions for EPA, it looks like we're ready to move into the deliberation phase of our agenda. So not seeing any additional hands up, I invite people just for some structure here we'll start out with a discussion about Chapter 2 on the policy relevant issues. And we can start our focus maybe on the primary standard. And I just invite people to raise your hands and make sure that you air in public the key points that you think need to be shared with respect to your impressions of the draft integrated review plan. Oh, apparently there's more slides. I'm sorry, I just got a note in the chat. EPA, have you finished presenting? Did you want to continue? I apologize, jumped ahead.
Yeah, I think we are done. I believe the additional slides are all just supplemental material that would be available for your, throughout the discussions or available for your review or to look through. But yeah, those are all just supplemental.
Okay. So we won't go through those unless anybody has a request to do that. All right, so getting back to the panel, I invite people to comment.
I wonder if it would be helpful to just share the document, or is that too tedious? I mean, I have it up, but because I think different people had comments on different sections.
Yeah, we could go through a little bit more specifically. Let's see what Perry has to say, and we'll see if we need to do that.
Very good. I was questioning in my review of the policy relevant issues about how the work of the CASAC relates to some of the other ongoing efforts by EPA to address lead and air and overall to address disparities in the overall EPA lead strategy. So there's a few things happening that I wasn't clear how that fits into this policy review. One, of course, being the current proposed NESHAP for lead acid battery manufacturing that would impact stack emissions from those facilities. There's also the ongoing review of a draft strategy to reduce lead exposures and disparities in U.S. communities that recently just had a comment period. And then the EPA has also announced that they're looking at under another part of the Clean Air Act, the endangerment findings for the aviation fuel issue and regulating piston engine aircraft fuels. So I didn't see reference to any of that, and I thought all of that has a large role in this policy review. So I wanted to just get a handle on how that is integrated into this review. Thanks.
Thanks. Is that something that EPA wants to respond to now?
Dr. Shepard, this is Deirdre Murphy. I could just help for clarity if it's useful. What were mentioned are other activities surely that the agency is involved in with regard to lead. And of course, our office is well aware, and in fact, many of us that are involved in the NAAQS review process are also involved in various EPA team efforts on those activities. But I would say they don't directly impact this. This activity is looking at the standards themselves and the evidence that relates to consideration of the requisite protection provided by those standards. Do we have new information that calls into question the adequacy of those standards for protecting public health? So it's related in that it's lead, and there's a lot of other great work going on in the agency with regard to lead, but it is a distinct activity. I'll just additionally note that the lead strategy, which as you noted is being developed, a draft went out last year, we'll do a final this year. The draft strategy mentions all of these activities, the NESHAP work, the aviation fuel work, and also the NAAQS work, because those are among the many activities that EPA is focused on for lead just now.
Thank you. Chris Johnson.
Yeah, so looking through the Section 2, Chapter 2 of the draft IRP, one of the policy relevant questions that's included reads, to what extent does the newly available evidence alter our understanding of the concentration response relationships between lead in children's blood and reduced IQ? And I think a couple of other panelists have brought this issue up in different contexts. I was wondering if part of the work going forward will include consideration of whether there are indicators or tests of cognitive function that are better than IQ for the purpose of establishing a relationship between lead in blood or bone or any other media for that matter, and intellectual development or functioning.
Okay, that seems like a useful thing to incorporate. Hey, Bruce.
Yeah. Thank you, Leanne. Couple things I wanted to bring up, and again, several people brought up different elements of these, some of the new science that's come out. One, and I don't believe that these were incorporated in the last ISA, but correct me please if I'm wrong. But one quite important document came out of EPA. It was looking at the relationship of airborne lead in the form of TSP. This is a study that Jennifer Richmond Bryant was the first author, and they found a decelerating exposure response relationship with airborne lead and children's blood lead concentrations. Now that is with TSP, and there's a lot of unknown about what would happen at PM 2.5 or PM 10, but the fact that you're seeing a rather steep rise in blood lead concentrations beginning, a sharp rise beginning at the low levels would suggest that lowering blood lead levels around the country where they're the lowest would have a bigger impact on children's blood lead levels. So that was item one that I think is relevant for us to discuss. The second, as Deirdre, I think it was mentioned, 70% of all lead emissions, 70% or so are from aircraft, and those particles are quite small. The lead particles emitted by aircraft are quite small, I think in the 4 nanometer range. And I think that raises some interesting questions about how we should be measuring airborne lead. And then there's also been 2 additional studies, one published, one peer-reviewed in a report and publicly available, but not published, by Sami Zarin, looking at blood lead levels children who live around general airports, and finding quite sizable increases in the proportion of children who exceed various cutoffs. In his 2017 paper, it was focused on blood lead levels greater than 10 microgram per deciliter. In the unpublished but peer-reviewed report from Reed Hillview Airport, he focused most of the report on children 18 years of age or older, but he ran a series of models looking at toddlers who are better indicators and probably just as good of indicators of airborne lead as the air monitors, since we don't have enough air monitors around. I guess it's convenient that they're so good. And the background fraction of children who had blood lead levels greater than 3.5 was about 2%, but it jumped up to almost 6% if you lived within half a mile of the airport. And if you included children who lived downwind during heavy traffic, it jumped up to 10%, exceeded 3.5 microgram per deciliter. I don't know if the air monitors exceeded the EPA standard at any point in time. If not, again, that raises important questions about the existing standard. So I'll stop there for a minute, but just maybe to make one other point. I think Debra, Selecta, and maybe one other person mentioned this, and that is at these very small particle size, just like with manganese, we expect that some of these particles could go directly up the olfactory nerve into the brain, and again raises questions about how we measure airborne lead.
Thank you. Susan.
Thanks. I just wanted, for the record, I wrote this in my comments, but I think I just wanted to support and expand on Chris's comment that it's really important to think about alternative neurodevelopmental and cognitive outcomes besides IQ. I'm involved in the ECHO consortium, the Environmental Influences on Child Health Outcomes, and we've worked really hard to think about what IQ means in terms of its historical use, oftentimes as a source for discrimination and also as a measure that has substantial bias. So I think there are many reasons why thinking about other outcomes going forward will be valuable. And I also think it's probably the case for many contaminants, including lead, that other cognitive measures can sometimes be even more sensitive to lead exposure. So there's many dimensions in which thinking and explicitly acknowledging other than IQ outcomes in this planning phase, I think, is really important.
Great, thank you. Davin?
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to just highlight a couple comments that were relevant to this section of the review that I had. One is, following up on the comments from Bruce. I was just sort of curious in general about the removal of TSB lead measurements from NCORE sites and how that might be potentially hindering the goals of this process in trying to reduce our uncertainty with regards to exposures and impacts at low concentration levels. I understand that those measurements were halted given that levels were lower than the standard. But if we're seeking to assess, are there issues of concern at levels lower than the current standard, does that process require sustained measurements of very low levels in regions that would be within the scope of that network as opposed to the SLAMS network? And so that was just sort of a question for me, and it kind of spanned, I think, both sections. Another comment is in terms of a question to be considered is whether there's disproportionate exposure to marginalized communities or disproportionate risk. I think the second half of that question is addressed is discussed in section 3 of this document, but neither kind of really brought up in section 2, and I didn't see disproportionate exposure really discussed in either section. And so, when we think of sort of other criteria pollutants that have really strong spatial gradients near sources like NO2, the sort of environmental justice considerations of exposure are something that's a burgeoning area of investigation. And I was curious if that would fit within the scope of what's included in the ISA. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and building upon that comment, I would expect that these marginalized communities have a lot of legacy exposures that are not and legacy lead in the environment that is not airborne, and then the airborne could add on to that, so that might be particularly important in those communities, because not just because of the airborne source, but they end up being impacted even more. Other comments on this, on the topic of policy relevant issues for the primary standard? Anything else anybody wants to bring up at this time?
What? Sorry.
Go ahead, Bruce.
Well, one other study just to mention, and I put this in my comments, but Erica Resnick in Cincinnati, the CCAP study, they didn't have good measures of lead exposure, blood lead levels of exposure during the first 12 years of life, but they did have measures of airborne lead, and they used PM 2.5. And then they had a blood lead concentration taken at 12 years of age. But what they found was quite intriguing, and that is they found a series of signals suggesting that the airborne levels itself were predicting some behavior problem scores, elevation in behavior problem scores. So presumably at levels that are quite low. And then just to add on to some of the questions about vulnerable communities, pretty consistently, as the EPA and others have shown, children who live around general airports do tend to be lower income. And so there is some added vulnerability there.
Thank you. Susan.
Yeah, I don't know if this is appropriate for this section of volume 2, but I think another big picture issue that may have important policy implications is how going forward we think about outcomes that may have a long latency between lead exposure and their manifestation. So I'm thinking particularly about neurodegenerative disorders of aging, which increasingly there's some evidence to suggest may be related to much earlier exposures to lead. And those can have tremendous public health impacts. And how to think about a regulatory process that looks at current measures and what those implications are for disease risk 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the line is, I appreciate, really complicated. But I think given sort of the nature of our population and the importance of aging associated morbidity and mortality, I think that, figuring out a way to creatively incorporate that challenging latency into the policy process would be worth a try. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I think it's a valuable thing to consider.
Thank you. Howard.
Yeah, 3 issues that I'll just focus on that I put into my comments. One of them is that I'm part of a group that's working with Chris Thayer in the IRIS office on a systematic review of the violence question. That would be quite a game changer, but there's been an increasing number of studies looking at lead exposure and violence, which I think the timing might actually coincide enough to include that as part of the assessment. The second is that there's a bit of attention to pregnancy-associated risks, but what I didn't see is an acknowledgement that, in fact, the prenatal exposure to lead may have impacts on childhood neurobehavioral outcomes that are separate, distinct, and additive to what happens to childhood lead exposures. Understanding the whole life course, but also the cumulative effect over the life course that integrates prenatal exposures would be important. And the third thing is that given the importance of this risk assessment to consider susceptible populations, what I didn't see was acknowledgement of the growing number of studies looking at fairly common allelic variants that are demonstrating evidence of subpopulation susceptibility to worse lead impacts on whether it's intelligence or neurodegenerative disease or other outcomes. Same thing with with other comorbidities like diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And I think these are going to be big issues considering the aging of the population and the understanding more about the susceptible subpopulations.
Okay, thank you. Shall we move on to the policy relevant issues for the review of the secondary standard and open it up to see if anyone wants to comment on that? And I think with a number of these things, it's in the end, in this consultation, it's just important that we get our comments out into the public domain. So the document provides some structure to do that, but don't feel too constrained by that, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So anyone have any comments about the policy relevant issues for review of the secondary standard? Okay, not seeing any volunteers at the moment. Again, feel free to bring things up as they occur to you throughout the meeting. Oh, wait, Susan.
Yeah, I just sort of have a question, and I'm not sure, again, if this is quite the right place, so as is mentioned in these documents, so much of airborne lead ends up then being deposited and redistributed through a variety of systems and can be reflected in soil lead and sediment lead and other pathways of exposure. So I guess it seems like a really important policy, or maybe it's an ISA issue, is to think about how much airborne lead contributes to ecosystem distribution of lead and the implications of that. And if that's an area where the existing models are adequate, or if that's an area where there needs to be more thought, especially as ambient air levels decline. What are the implications of that for distribution of lead through other media in the ecosystems?
Yeah, thank you. Kathy.
Yeah, just to address some of the comments prior on pathways, additional pathways and models to evaluate the multi-pathway system. One of the things I didn't mention is that in the air toxicology and risk assessment section, we have a hotspots program, and in there, one of the things that the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment has done has put together a guidance document for doing health risk assessments and incorporating multi-pathway analysis. And I mentioned that in my comments that we submitted some of the individual coefficients that we developed regarding those pathways. And so I just wanted to say that adding some of those pathways that weren't part of the prior risk assessment would be potentially valuable for the next assessment of risk.
Great, thank you. Chris Johnson, you have a comment.
Yeah, I actually put this in my comments for chapter 3, but as I think about it, maybe it might be more relevant for the section on secondary standard in chapter 2, and that is whether the review might consider whether critical loads assessment approaches have advanced to the point where they might be useful in helping to set a secondary standard for lead.
Thank you. All right, I don't see any additional hands up. So maybe we'll move on to chapter 3, which is development of the ISA. And just broadly speaking, the first section is 3.1 on the organization and scope. Well, no, scope is the next, and scope is 3.2. And so checking to see if anybody has any comments they want to make about either of those sections. Not seeing anything. We'll move on to the specific scientific questions. And the first section is source to concentration, dealing with air quality, atmospheric science, fate, and transport. And so there's a series of questions listed there, and see if there's anything else that anybody wants to add to that or comment on what's there. The next section, 3.3.2, is exposure, toxicokinetics, and biomarkers. And so there's a list of questions there. And I see Phil Goodrum wants to make a comment about this section.
Yeah, hi, there were a number of things that caught my eye here that connect with this section and the next section. I think the top of my list is the idea of mixtures and questions about, the state of the science and evidence to support whether mixtures are how we what the science is on mixtures and the exposure response relationship for lead and how mixtures impact that. But we're used to thinking about controlling for co-exposure to other contaminants, so we can isolate what the relationship is for lead. And what I thought was interesting, I would support this, is the idea of thinking about trying to explicitly introduce co-contaminants. And there were two places that I think would be helpful to at least consider, and this might be either in the mechanistic models or in the statistical models that we apply to the epidemiological data. And one is the concept of baseline. So this might connect with, for example, the fourth bullet down in 3.3.2, where we're asking what's the new evidence on the relationship between air lead and blood lead and the uncertainties in that relationship and the body burdens. So if there is a additive or synergistic or other effect of other air pollutants or other co-contaminants, what do we understand about the baseline exposures, what the lag time might be between when those exposures occurred? Do they have to be concurrent? Is there, what's the scientific evidence around relationships between body burden and health effects, or external dose and health effects of those other co-contaminants? So there are a number of things that could be built upon, with the mixtures question. Mixtures does come up explicitly later in subsection 3.3.3.2. There on the top of page 311. And that particular question is what new evidence has become available to help discern health effects of exposure to lead within mixtures, including mixtures with toxic metals or other pollutants. And we might add not only what the health effects might be and how those are impacted, but also the exposure response relationship itself. So it's more than just trying to understand what the health implications might be of different levels of lead, but how that change in blood lead health effect relationship, that delta, how is that impacted by different magnitudes or time courses of exposure. So I'll stop there, but I wanted to support the theme here of trying to introduce mixtures and maybe encourage structuring the questions a little bit more around how would we explicitly use that information.
Thank you. That's helpful to think about how to reframe that. Susan.
I think in this section, based on Bruce's comments, and he can chime in better than I, and Debra Selecta's comments in her written statement, I think somewhere in this section there should be some focus on understanding whether inhalational exposures actually are enhanced by virtue of particle size, that uptake of ultrafine particulate matter or nanoparticles resulting from aviation fuel combustion or other sources may be much more efficient than other exposure pathways and may disproportionately impact CNS concentrations of lead, and understanding that sort of kinetic process may be important to figuring out how to weight airborne versus other exposure pathways in terms of their health risks, especially around neurologic health risks. Because I think that's a very much evolving area of research. And historically, a lot of the evidence of nasal uptake of small particulates was in rodents and their obligate nasal breathers, and there was some concern that humans are a little different. So I think sort of updating that literature and understanding the implications for the bioburden consequent to inhalation versus other exposure pathways will be really valuable in this phase of the ISA.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Phil, you still have your hand up, but that's a legacy hand, right? Bill Stubblefield, you're next.
Yes, ma'am. I wasn't really sure where to chime in here because I have a number of questions that pass from section 2 to section 3, 2, et cetera. One of the concerns that I have is what I kind of view as I read it, and perhaps I've taken it out of context, but limitations with regard to the kind of data that are considered in the process, especially as it relates to coming up with the secondary criteria. There's a statement in here that studies on mine tailings, biochar, industrial effluent, et cetera, are not within the scope of the ISA due to high concentrations of lead. And I guess my concern there is that in an environmental context, it's really difficult to separate lead from other metals and other kinds of contaminants, especially if you're trying to limit it just to airborne concentrations. I certainly understand why you would want to do that. However, the real world doesn't exist like that. And so the issue that was raised by Phil, I think is really germane and is very important to keep in mind. And that is the question of mixtures and how one goes into taking into consideration the issue of mixtures. The majority of the data that are being generated today affecting effects, I would say are being predominantly driven out of Europe because of the regulatory requirements that are in force in Europe. And so that's where new information is coming about. I'm not aware of a lot of data that is specifically being generated within the U.S., especially with regard to the effects of lead only. So to the extent that we can open the evaluation to consider, quote, mixtures, and also to consider data that comes from these other sorts of sources, I think it would probably certainly inform our capability to evaluate potential effects and specifically questions that come up as they relate to soil effect concentrations and sediment effect concentrations. There's a effort that is going forth in the Office of Water under a CRADA arrangement to look at the effects of the effects on bioavailability that are due to water quality parameters and the like, and that's moving forward, and that's very good. But I don't think that there is the same level of effort moving forward in soils and sediment realm. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Perry.
Yes, I wanted to second the fourth suggestion on mixtures. Obviously, the data over the last decade or so has gotten much stronger and should be considered here. But I had two comments on this section that I wanted to share. One being that the document, and this had come up, I think, in passing earlier today, the document refers to race, ethnicity as a risk factor. It talks about it being a biological factor, but it really doesn't question whether air emissions differ based on race, ethnicity, based on geography and neighborhood patterns. And whether these exposures are over and above what might be coming from housing to those same communities. So I think that's a key point that's missing in this section. And the other issue that I wanted to raise in terms of exposures is that this is really geared to permitted industries and ambient air as a result of these ongoing day-to-day exposures, emissions. But what I don't see discussed at all is sort of the intermittent high exposures that might result from paint removal activities. And I don't mean residential paint, but industrial paints that are used on roadways, bridges, steel structures. And as these are maintained or removed with abrasive blasting, they're known to have intermittent very high exposures. How does this standard account for that? How does the ISA account for that higher intermittent exposure? And is that something that can be addressed explicitly in the ISA? Would be something I'd like to see.
Great, thanks. And one of the things that came to mind, and I'll bring it up at the end, I think will be very valuable since we're not writing consensus comments. Some of these points are resonating very strongly, and people are affirming them in their oral comments. But I think when you go to update your individual comments, things that you're hearing in the meeting that are resonating strongly with you, I think would be value added if you could include those in your individual comments, because since we're not going to be writing any consensus comments or a letter, I think multiple individual comments that hit on the same points will, I think, be even more powerful for EPA. So I encourage people, as you're hearing things in the meeting, to be taking notes and incorporating those into your individual comments. Chris.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions from this section for Steve Dutton, if he's available to answer a couple of questions. Are you there, Steve?
I'm here.
Yeah. So This section includes stuff about the causality determination, which you talked about towards the end of your presentation. So the first question is, there are these two tables, table 3.1 and table 3.2, I think, yeah, that show the causality determinations from the last ISA for both the health outcomes and the ecosystems or ecological effects. So am I correct in assuming that now is the time for the panel to suggest any outcomes that are missing that should be included, or is there a future point at which that conversation will be had?
Now would certainly be a good point to identify any sort of outcomes or categories that we could be looking into. And then there will be additional opportunities, when we develop the ISA and include those causal conclusions next time we meet to discuss the ISA. But certainly now would be a great time to raise anything that we might want to be thinking about as we develop those conclusions.
Just speaking for myself, I'll say that it looks pretty comprehensive for the areas that I'm involved in, but I just wanted to ask that on behalf of the group in case people see some outcomes that might be useful to include. The second question is the causality determination itself. So one of the things about the structure or the proposed process for the ISA is that it'll focus on literature since the last ISA, which makes perfect sense. But thinking about this in terms of the causality determination, looking at one of these, I'm just going to pick one, auditory function decrements. It says suggestive of a causal relationship. That may have been based on, I don't know, 12 studies up until the time of the last ISA. And now maybe there's 5 more that come into play. And you're going to make a decision, or somebody's going to make a decision about whether that causality determination should be upgraded or downgraded or remain the same. So how will you go about doing that in terms of incorporating? You have to probably incorporate the old studies as well as the new ones. Can you talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, and actually you raised actually 2 really good points here. I'll touch on them both. One is how we incorporate, previous evidence in addition to just not, the increment, but also the prior evidence we had that went into the previous ISA. And you also raise a second interesting point about, how granular do you get in these categories? So I'll kind of real quick touch on both of those. So, the short answer to the first question is we take full account of, take into full incorporation the previous ISA and all the conclusions. So the new ISA is building on that existing evidence, and we try to do, our best to both bring forward the key conclusions from the previous ISA and then fold the new information in with that. So you'll actually, in each successive ISA, you will see a lot of studies that are recited that were included before. But our main question in the new ISA is focusing on this increment. Where does it add additional information? Does it change any of our, thinking in regard to causality or major conclusions that we drew in the last ISA? Or does it just build on, the evidence that we already had there? So we certainly are doing both. So it is the increment plus what was already in there. For the lead ISA, the last CASAC advised us to do quite a bit more kind of granularity in our causal determinations. And this is something, we kind of discuss and go back and forth with internally and with CASAC is how effective is it to get, is there enough evidence to get real down to these granular levels, or should we be sort of aggregating that up to kind of a higher taxonomy? And we have the same question on the welfare side. So that's certainly something within the scope of CASAC to comment on, whether you feel like some of these causal conclusions could be tied together or grouped together to provide kind of maybe a stronger position or story.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay, I think Perry, you have a legacy hand up, is that right? And so we'll move on to Bruce.
Yeah, thank you. So I did want to follow up on Chris's point and a couple of other areas that I think could be explored under the causal determination. One would be preterm birth. There's been a number of studies since the last ISA And some of them are down at low levels. One that yet hasn't been published, but what we're finding is that even at a mean blood level of 0.5 microgram per deciliter in a population with a mean blood lead of 0.5 microgram per deciliter, across that range, we see about a 50% increase in women with higher blood lead levels for preterm birth. But when we look at it in relationship to vitamin D insufficiency, we see that women with higher blood leads and vitamin D insufficiency are about 2 to 3-fold more likely to give birth preterm. So there's several studies, new studies on preterm birth. And then there was an interesting study looking at what happened after NASCAR decided to take lead out of their gasoline. And there was a significant increase in birth weight and duration of pregnancy, or by corollary, about a 4% reduction in preterm births. And those NASCAR events are really quite short-lived. And so not only does that raise questions about the impact of low level lead on preterm birth, but also the way lead is averaged, airborne lead is averaged. So those would be a couple additional comments, and then yet one more, a meta-analysis looking at preeclampsia and pregnant women, of course, that needs to be looked at more carefully. Thank you.
You know, building upon that, those paint removal on bridges too would be sort of similar to a short-term event that could be actually pretty important that came up earlier. Gavin?
Yeah, thank you. I have one question that actually pertains to the scoping section. And sorry, I didn't get this in here before we moved on from that. Maybe I'll start with that. And it's just, perhaps it's just the way this is written, but there's discussion of the health appendices. So this is in section 3.2 on page, kind of spanning pages 3.4 and 3.5. And the way that information will be integrated, results of new studies will be integrated with previous findings along with any new interpretations. The ISA will also integrate previous information, which is great, and I fully expect that there'll be an integrated kind of ultimate assessment of the state of knowledge. In thinking though about the charge questions, which are often sort of phrased as, does the current evidence alter our conclusion since the last review, or does newly available evidence further inform us? I wonder if it would be good to add language in the scoping to explicitly state that in addition to an integrated assessment, there will be an assessment of incremental changes to the knowledge in order to respond to these questions about how knowledge has evolved. Again, this is perhaps the plan already, but I think it would be just nice to kind of confirm that the scope will be looking at the incremental change in knowledge as well as just the integrated current state. Then a specific question that I had about section 3.3, I appreciate the section on uncertainties on the health effects. This was down in section 3.3.3.2. There's discussion of uncertainties. But there's one that I wasn't quite sure about, the sort of rationale for why it's included, and maybe this could be expanded on. It just says, are seasonal trends evident for lead concentrations, exposures, or lead-related health effects? And so, I'm wondering, is this aimed at getting at some uncertainty in whether the seasonal metric itself is sufficiently capturing the relationship with the health effects that we're interested in? Or is there another reason for calling out trends here in this case? And if so, why the focus on seasonal trends rather than annual trends, diurnal trends, daily trends? It stood out a little bit in this list of kind of broader senses of uncertainties, and it wasn't really connected back to a specific charge questions. So I'll leave my comments with that, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Do you want some clarification from EPA on that point? Would this be value added, or just leave it out there for?
If it's something that, yeah, they feel like they have something they like to say right now about that, that's great. But otherwise, I'm sure they'll take this kind of feedback into account during the process.
Okay. Steve, did you want to say something?
I was going to see if Evan Kaufman wanted to comment on that. Evan, did you have thoughts there?
Sure. Yeah, I could just say that because there are these seasonal trends in blood lead levels, it's getting a little bit more at sort of understanding seasonality bias when comparing blood lead samples across studies, as well as in studies looking at health effects. So sort of looking at potential bias there.
Thank you. Let's see. It sounds like we're ready to move on. We've been actually talking about the health effects section 3.3.3. But now I see more hands up. So, Brisa.
Yes, thank you. I want to point out to the section on life stages and populations. I think this is a section that could be slightly more fleshed out in terms of some of the issues raised earlier about sort of long-term exposures, and also the issues about like preterm and fetal exposures and so on. So I think that there's a couple of bullets there that kind of touch on subpopulations, but I think it could be made a little bit more explicit. I think this is also a good section to talk about or include more explicitly the issues of disparities in vulnerable populations relating to racial disparities. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Perry.
Yes, I had one comment on the table regarding causality summaries, and this backs up, I think, a suggestion by Howard Hu earlier that maybe that we break apart what was called externalizing behaviors and looking at causality, and look at violence as a separate item potentially, and that might be worth considering with some of the growing body of literature around that issue. And that was a suggestion I had in regards to this causality section. Thanks.
Thank you. Joel. You're muted.
You're on mute, Joe.
Thank you. So the very interesting literature describing the two-way interactions in a relationship between the gut microbiome and brain function is just growing rapidly. You can't avoid it. And our characterization of the microbiome of the different levels of the respiratory tract are not nearly as well developed. However, that there are several studies that describe both dysbiosis as well as changes in microbiome metabolites in the gut of experimental animals following exposure to lead. So while the importance of the human microbiome as a specific target for lead is far from being established, I would really like to see the ISA consider the microbiome as a specific target that might be mediating lead toxicity elsewhere in the human body. And I think if the EPA did that, they would get out in front of this issue, and they would be both doing a service to investigators with this comprehensive review to identify productive areas of or gaps in knowledge, as well as set the stage for the next review in the coming years.
Great, thank you. I think we're still on the section of 3.3.3 on health effects. Anything more that anyone wants to add that you haven't yet voiced? Let's see, George, I think you're next.
Sure, thanks. Overall, the section is pretty good. I kind of had I was wondering, there's a lack of any mention of the CDC guidance for blood lead levels of concern. Also, it's notable, and I got this wrong in my individual comments, this CDC revised those last fall. I actually wasn't aware until I poked around. It went from 5 to I believe 3.5. If I'm wrong, please someone correct me. Micrograms per deciliter. That's notable. It implies that, that maybe we know a little more this time around. One could, I'm not saying I will, but we could imply that 5 to 3.5, translate that into the max of 0.15 down to maybe 0.1. I mean, there's clearly, I think, there's more information out there this time around based upon what the CDC did. And there's no mention of the CDC blood level guidance or limits in this at all, which maybe that should be when we get to the ISA. Hopefully that will be in there. And an unrelated topic, but kind of while I have the floor, there's been some comments on ultrafine lead. It's worth pointing out that is only an exposure concern very near combustion sources, which includes very near general aviation airports, but the lifetime of ultrafine particles is short. They grow up. It doesn't mean they disappear, but they grow up out of that size range. And in an odd way, that's similar to the very large particles greater than 10 microns, which also don't travel very far. So oddly enough, the really small and the really big both have a limited, very limited scale of influence. I know there's been some discussion of that already today, so I just thought I'd throw that out. Thanks.
Bruce.
Yes, I wanted to follow up on George's comment about the 3.5. I've already talked about it really more to provide context, but I guess when we were reviewing the decision to lower it from 5 to 3.5, somebody brought up, well, the EPA uses it for setting standards. And I actually had to go check because I couldn't understand why they would want to use the CDC's recommended value of 5 or 3.5 in setting standards, because it's completely arbitrary and dependent upon economic considerations, not based upon the science. What the action level was set at, the 97.5th percentile, was really just economic consideration. And so while it's useful to think about it and talk about it to provide a context, sometimes the mean, you lose some of the depth of or the nuance of the evidence. But it seems to me that the guidance that CDC gave, that there is no safe level, is more relevant specifically to the EPA standard setting process than the 3.5 or the 5 microgram per deciliter action level that preceded it.
I agree, thanks.
Thanks. Any further comments on section 3.3, health effects? We'll move on to 3.3.4, at-risk life stages and populations and public health impact. Seeing no further comments on that, George.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's fine.
This is going to be a little bit of an echo from the PM review. But a sentence that in 334 that caught my attention, emphasis was placed on health effects for which there is a causal or likely causal relationship. And while I absolutely understand that, in the discussions we had in the PM review, which would apply here as well, we don't want outcomes that are suggestive of a causal relationship to get a short shrift, so to speak. There's always the possibility that, as we talked about in the PM review, with a closer look, some of those potentially that are in the suggestive could bubble up to the likely causal. So I just wanted to make sure that we didn't that category of suggestive did get its sufficient attention in that context.
Thank you. Okay, I think we'll move on to ecological effects, section 3.3.5. So anybody have any comments you want to make about the ecological effects? Not seeing any hands up. Maybe I'll just step back and see if there's any comments that people haven't made in your individual comments, or anything that resonated with you during the meeting that you want to emphasize in public. I would encourage you to do that at this time. Maybe particularly if there are a couple of people who haven't chimed in, if you want to just speak up with the things that resonated to you, that would be helpful too. No pressure. Yeah, I'm not, oh, Bruce.
Yeah, I think it's, and Howard pointed this out in his comments, but I think it's worth bringing up. There's been quite a bit of evidence now since the last ISA about lead and coronary heart disease, and that's particularly important since it's such a common cause of death and disease. And that new evidence supports the idea that there might not be a safe level, that the effects might occur fairly quickly. And from what I think is fascinating from a historical perspective, it may be that lead played a much more dominant role in the epidemic of coronary heart disease over the past century than most of us recognize, and that the decline in lead during the 1980s might have been the central reason for this precipitous decline in hypertension that was observed. And so I think it deserves some added attention, not only because of the deaths associated with it, the fact that we've underestimated it considerably, but lead has probably played a central role in the leading cause of death worldwide. And yet the vast majority of us don't include it in that regular litany of sitting on the couch, smoking, and whatever other risk factors, high cholesterol, that we all can flippantly talk about. But even those of us in environmental health may not readily mention lead. So I think it deserves a lot more attention than it's got in the past.
Thank you. Susan.
Yeah, I know you don't want to hear from me again, but
No,
just just for the record, I think it's worth mentioning that, and this came up already, that looking at at-risk populations based on a whole host of factors, comorbidities, age, life stage, whatever, and race, when race and ethnicity are considered as either risk factors for enhanced exposure or enhanced sensitivity to exposure, I think we need to just be cognizant of current thinking, race and ethnicity are not biological constructs, they're social constructs, and modeling race and ethnicity has been used a lot in the human epidemiologic literature because it's a convenient thing to do, but it's pretty clear or increasingly clear that race and ethnicity per se are not risk factors as much as other correlates of race and ethnicity, including experience of discrimination and structural racism. And I think hopefully the new literature that's available for the ISA will begin to think about those issues in a more appropriate way. And existing literature that may not have done that in the past has hopefully been updated, or there's been progress in how we think about race and ethnicity. I think it's just really important, especially in the context of a EPA regulatory process, that the ways in which we think about vulnerable populations are appropriate and up to date with state-of-the-art standards.
Thank you. Yeah, and the PM CASAC hit on this issue a fair amount too, so it's already given some advice to EPA in this realm in general. Mark.
Yeah, so I know we talked about that in the PM too, but I second Susan's points. I think those are important. I wanted to just touch on one thing, and I'm not quite sure where this goes in, but I wanted to raise it related a little bit also to Bruce's point. Made me think about this, which is that for some of these effects of chronic outcome type effects of lead exposures that takes a long time to have the exposures build up all the adverse impacts. One thing that I don't think got much attention in the last ISA, if any, is possibilities of bias around study design. And so with the idea being that, when you're looking at an aging cohort for late life chronic health effects, there hasn't been really, to my mind, enough attention paid to the fact that you're effectively conditioning on those people getting that old. And without going to detail, that actually tends, given what we know about environmental health effects of these toxicants, to depress effect estimates downward. And I know it's sometimes hard to know how much that's happening, but I do think it's something that is worth spending a little text on to point that fact out, that we are likely being conservative in some of our estimates. And I have a paper on that with Howard, specifically related to more cardiovascular mortality. That's what Bruce's point flagged that in my head. But anyway, I'm not exactly sure where that goes, but I just wanted to get it out there.
Yeah, no, and I think we're actually at the place where we need to make sure that any further comments get out there. We're not in a section anymore. We're just wanting to make sure that we give our full and complete advice to EPA at this point. So, anything else that you've thought about in your review and your individual comments, anything that has resonated with you during the meeting that you want to emphasize in public, I encourage people to state that now. We did anticipate that we wouldn't need the full 4 hours, and it seems to me like we're starting to run out of advice for EPA, so that's fine. We can definitely end early and get a little bit of our days back. But I invite people one last time to see if raise your hand if there's anything additional that you want to provide in terms of advice to the EPA. Yes, Kathy.
Oh, I might as well mention the California Air Resources Board report on wildfire effects from the Paradise Fire. That's a newly published report that looks at PM 2.5 and lead aerosol within that PM 2.5, and it's how far it traveled from the point of the fire and what the levels were. So it's something that I don't know if it would be captured in the review process. Just want to mention it.
So you're bringing up a point that I don't think I saw in the document, that wildfire smoke could also be an important source of lead, and that's something that should be addressed as well. Bruce.
Yeah, I was just going to back over some of my comments, and I just wanted to bring this up. For those of you who aren't familiar with quantile regression, it's kind of fun because it gives you a different way to look at data. I'm having a lot of fun working with statisticians. They have such interesting concepts. And it's just great to know that statisticians have a good sense of humor. So quantile regression, there was a study out of Wisconsin, and what they found was that lead exposure adversely impacted children's reading and math abilities. But when you use the quantile regression analysis, what you can see is that the children who already had poor reading scores did even more poorly. And that gets to this point about vulnerable populations. And in this particular study, African-American children would have been affected to a greater extent. So that's worth keeping in mind. And so we actually have some data. And there was modification with mothers with lower education. I believe it was education. It could have been income. But in any case, additional strikes against kids who already were struggling.
Okay, thank you. All right, any final comments? I also invite EPA if there's any questions you have for us or anything else you want to ask us. Maybe this is a time to share that. No, I'm not expecting anything, but I'm just inviting you if you would like to do that. So I think, given that we seem to have reached the end of our consultation, I will just give a little bit of a summary of where we're at. So offline, Aaron will communicate a schedule, but we invite everyone to update your individual comments. And as I said earlier in the meeting, I think it would be value added for everyone to think about things you want to add to your individual comments based on what you've heard, even if you don't go into much detail, just emphasizing things that you thought were particularly important that you heard during the conversation, I think will benefit EPA so that they can proceed with their draft ISA benefiting from our collective wisdom. And I think with that, I will turn it over to Aaron to close the meeting.
Yes, that's correct. So I will follow up with the schedule in terms of timeline for you to send in revisions to your individual comments. Then what a consultation is, again, is, Leanne will just, have a kind of pro forma cover letter to the administrator indicating that this consultation took place, and then that the panel member individual comments is appended to that letter. So that's all a consultation is. Then our next review, again, will depend on when EPA finishes the ISA and when that's ready. And I think based on their slides, it said early 2023. And again, hopefully the trajectory of COVID will stay low. And I think we would try to plan on having a face-to-face meeting at that time, most likely in North Carolina area. So anyway, stay tuned for that. But after this consultation on the IRP, that would, I believe that will be the next review activity. So we'll just be in touch then. And okay, Phil, I think you had a question.
Yeah, just a clarification. So if we have updates to comments or comments to send, do that as soon as possible, given they're going to be attached to Leanne's letter. Is that?
That's correct. And I'll send out a deadline for you to make those revisions to your individual comments. So I'll follow up with an email regarding that. Okay, I think we could be adjourned. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you, everybody.
Aaron. Thanks, Leanne.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Aaron, and thank you,
Thank
Leanne.
you.
Pleasure to see everyone.
Bye.